Okay, let's break some of this down. Also joining me is Law&Crime legal analyst Jonna Spilbor. John, I want to get right into it here. The idea that Hannah was brought over, she asked for a donut, and then she collapsed, and then Jason Weshy, Hannah's father, says she was acting normal that morning. There was nothing out of the ordinary. He brings her over, and then all of a sudden he gets this call from Lindsay Partin. Something's not adding up. What is not adding up? What am I not getting here?
Oh, there's so much that's not adding up, Jesse. Typically when we have, this is a really disturbing case. And when we have cases involving whether it's shaken baby syndrome or, some sort of trauma to a child, typically it doesn't turn into a credibility contest between babysitter and parent. Typically it relies on medical testimony, expert testimony. This case is different because you've got a father saying one thing entirely and a babysitter saying something else entirely, and I will be very surprised if we do not hear from the defendant in this case, Jesse, to explain, at least to get some sort of sense of whether the jury is going to find her credible, because her credibility is going to be key, and you can't rely on that if she doesn't take the stand.
We're about to jump back in, but I think I could get a quick question from Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, question for you. The defense has alleged that on the morning that Hannah's father brought Hannah to Partin's house, he had a blanket over her head, hood zipped all the way up. Seems strange, or was it just a cold day? What do you think?
I don't know, Jesse. It seems strange to me, just like this entire case seems strange. We need to determine the timing here because somebody has got to be lying. If you believe the defendant, the father brought this child in a horrendous condition. She had to call 911 immediately. Are we going to believe that? I guess we're going to have to wait and see.
Right, and you talk about who might be lying. So the defense has claimed that Jason Weshy has provided inconsistent statements or has lied, and the prosecution has said that the defendant provided inconsistent statements and has in fact admitted to hitting Hannah on prior occasions. Jonna, you had mentioned credibility. One of the things that we learned going into this case, and that was shown by the prosecution, is that Partin had admitted on a prior occasion to beating this child. I think the term was uppercutting her. How is that going to play into this case?
It's disgusting. It's not going to bode well for the defendant here, Jesse, because the jury's now going to have to say, okay, you're telling me that you poked this child in the chest and uppercut this child, but you want us to believe that you did not cause the severe injuries that ultimately led to her death. It's going to be a tough sell, in my opinion.
Jonna, let me ask you this. Maybe we are jumping too fast. Will the defense present their own experts to say, hey, we've seen falls before, we've seen face plants before, as the defendant has explained, and it can cause this exact set of injuries?
Yeah, so I respectfully disagree with Phil in that I think if you're defending Ms. Partin, you have to say, wait a minute, this wasn't even caused by child abuse. I reported that this child face planted the day before and her father did nothing about it. And then when he brought her over to me, oh my God, all hell was breaking loose and we had to call 911. I think that's a critical portion of this defendant's defense.
And if they can show that he really did bring her over in a covered state, why would he want to cover her up unless she had some sort of injuries? So Jonna, let's just talk about what we can anticipate here. One of the people that we believe is going to be called to the witness stand is the defendant herself. What can we expect?
I say, Jesse, we have to hear from her because as we discussed a little earlier in the show, this really is, it's a credibility contest in large part. Obviously, there's going to be some expert testimony about, were these injuries inflicted or were these injuries done because this little girl face planted while she was standing on a train? Like that expert testimony is going to be critical. But more critical than that is the jury going to believe this defendant?
Now, Jonna, if that evidence comes up, if that evidence comes up that she, touched this child or hit this child, does she have to talk away and say, hey, that's not really what happened. I kind of nudged her. I tried to get her to stop something and try to downplay it?
Absolutely. And, when the prosecution is cross-examining this defendant, I'm going to be watching like this because it's going to be horrible. It really, she's going to, as Phil said, she's going to have to be prepared very, very copiously by her attorneys and explain, I didn't inflict injuries that should have killed this child. I may have inflicted some, but they shouldn't have been fatal injuries.
Well, she's planning Or at least we think the plan is for her to take the stand. A lot could happen between now and then. They might feel at the end, she might feel that, hey, I chose, I don't want to take the stand. My defense attorney, our team has done a reasonable job, has done a sufficient job at raising reasonable doubt. And Jonna, we don't always know what to expect in this case. And a lot of times as we do our research, we are curious what to expect. And one of the things that I recall is that several months ago, this case had been continued for quite some time and we're finally at a trial. I think the defense was trying to prepare a confession expert. Now, have you ever heard of a confession expert, and how would that play into this case?
So that's interesting, Jesse, because really the only time that a confession expert, in my experience, comes into play is if you're trying to set forth a defense that the confession was a false confession. And what I don't know yet, and hopefully we'll find out perhaps, is, how long was this defendant interrogated for? Excuse me, not to mix apples and oranges, but one of the greatest examples of what should have been a false confession was back in the case, Steve, what's his name? Making a Murder. Do you remember?
Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. Brendan Dassey.
Yes, very much. Like, to me, that's a textbook example of how you get a false confession. I don't know if we're going to have the same set of circumstances here. I highly doubt it, to be honest with you.
Jonna, the developments in this case keep coming forward. One of the things we also learned is the defense plans to call Dr. Werner Spitz, who's a renowned forensic pathologist. He actually testified in the Casey Anthony trial. What can we expect with him? Because we believe he has a different theory about how Hannah died.
Well, as we had mentioned earlier, sometimes these cases come down to what we call a battle of the experts. And if the defense is going to bring forth an expert who's going to have a completely alternate theory that's going to assist the defense, well, the jury's going to, and hopefully for the defense case, put a whole lot of weight into that testimony.
Sure.
But keep in mind, the prosecution can come back with their own testimony to rebut that. So it's going to be, like I said, a battle of the experts, at least as far as the injuries are concerned.
And Jonna, we don't have an eyewitness to really what happened except for the defendant. And you and I keep talking about what would happen if she took the stand.
On the one hand, Jesse, I think she has to take the stand because not only is this going to be a battle of the experts, but the jury is going to want to hear from her. And we have to determine whether she's credible because her story is different from the father's story. So is she going to take the stand? And if she does, how is she going to explain away the fact that it should come up that she claimed to have, quote, undercut this child? And one of the things that we were talking during a break, perhaps what happened, this is speculation at this point, maybe the police put those words in her mouth. And if they did, that's going to be very important. In other words, if they said, describe for us how you put your hands on this child. And if what she described is a typical undercut, then the investigative officer could have said, so you undercut the child.
Uppercutting. Yeah, right. And yeah, that's a big point. And this defense team, who's been very fiery throughout this case, especially under cross-examination, you can imagine they would do something like that. Okay, Jonna, let's start with you as we are in this sidebar. You tell me, one of the things that the prosecution has to establish is that these injuries are a result of child abuse and not a fall. Partin had said that Hannah fell 2 times prior to this collapse and took a face plant, slipped off this toy train. What do you make of it?
So down the road, we're definitely going to need some medical testimony because when I look at this, I say to myself, all right, we're not claiming that the child took a fall off a file cabinet or a countertop or something higher than the 8 inches off the ground that this toy train was. So when you're trying to put 2 and 2 together, would that injury from a very low toy on a hard surface, mind you, which not for nothing, kind of stupid to have your kids playing on a hard surface like that where they could mobile things and get hurt, but would that cause a fatal injury? And the jury's going to need some explanation, although common sense says it probably would not. That's where I think this testimony is going.
And maybe we'll get more of an answer, Jonna, when Jason Wesche takes the stand, if he takes the stand. He might be called as a witness. So I'm curious what would happen then.
See, I think the import of his testimony is going to have to go to timing because we know that the defendant is saying, he brought me a damaged child, basically, and within moments she collapsed and I called 911, as opposed to what What his position should be is, I had nothing to do with these injuries. The injuries happened in her care, and they were life-threatening, ultimately fatal injuries. Is the jury going to believe him? That's going to be critical evidence in this case, in my opinion.
Wow. Okay, so Jonna, we've been talking about this case a lot. This witness for the defense thinks that, he suffered from some serious mental illness, still loved his daughter, is going to grieve for his daughter, believes that it was a result of this mental illness for what happened. I mean, that's my understanding. What do you make of it?
He's a great witness for the defense. They need him because, remember, the crux of this case isn't John Johnchuk didn't do it. The crux of this case is he's guilty but insane. And almost literally, Jesse, the defense here is the devil made him do it. And this expert is testifying that he had an honest but completely mistaken belief that he needed to kill his daughter, who he loved, in order to save the world. To put it very ineloquently, this guy was bat blank crazy. And that's what this expert is very eloquently saying, me not so much.
Now, Jonna, I know we're signing you off. Thanks so much for coming on as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and I'll see you soon.